James Martinez made a promise to his dying wife: he would keep living. For 3 years, he failed, moving through life unseen, untouched. Then he met Eleanor Harrison in room 237. She had 7 days to live, and no one coming to say goodbye. James stayed. What followed would change both of their lives forever. James Martinez had learned how to move through the world without leaving a mark. At 52, he worked the night shift at St. Catherine's Hospice in Portland. He mopped floors that never stayed clean for long. He emptied bins no one noticed. Doctors passed him without slowing. Nurses smiled without stopping. Families moved through him as if he were part of the walls. He earned $32,000 a year. Lived alone in a studio apartment where the radiator rattled and the neighbors argued through thin walls. He had no children. No savings. No one who waited for him to come home. His wife, Sarah, had died 3 years earlier. Cancer. The same word whispered in every room of this building. He had held her hand at the end. Stayed when others drifted away. Promised her she wouldn't be alone. That promise had outlived everything else. So every night at 11, James clocked in. Put on his uniform. Took up his mop and bucket. And became invisible again. He didn't know that before the week was over, something would shift, quietly, irrevocably. Thursday night, 11:47 p.m. James was mopping the hallway outside room 237 when he heard voices. 2 doctors. A nurse. A chart open between them. Eleanor Harrison. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 72 hours left, 1 week at most, the doctor said plainly. Did anyone reach her family? He asked. There is no family. Daughter died in a car accident 8 years ago. Ex-husband remarried, lives in Florida, wants nothing to do with her. We called every number in her file. No one's coming. So she'll be alone? The doctor asked. A pause. Then a sigh. Most of them do, the nurse replied. James stopped mopping, his hands tightened on the mop handle. He turned and looked through the small window of room 237. An elderly woman lay awake in the bed. Thin, pale, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if she were memorizing it. Machines hummed softly, the room was clean, empty, prepared for an ending. James thought of Sarah. Of how her eyes had searched the room in those final hours. Of the fear she'd tried, and failed, to hide. Of how she'd squeezed his hand, as if letting go might mean disappearing. Nobody should leave the world like that, he thought to himself. He set the mop against the wall, knocked once, and stepped inside. Excuse me, ma'am. Eleanor Harrison turned her head slowly. Her gaze landed on his uniform first, then his face. I'm James, he said. I work here. I thought, maybe you'd like some company. She studied him for a moment, measuring something he couldn't see. You don't have to, she said. You're working. I can spare a little time, James replied. A chair scraped softly as he pulled it closer. My name is Eleanor, she said after a while. Nice to meet you, Eleanor. They sat in silence for a while. Not awkward. Just 2 people sharing space. Then Eleanor spoke. They talk outside my door, as if I'm already gone. James nodded. They did that with my wife too. Her eyes shifted to him. Your wife? Yeah, Sarah. Cancer. Eleanor's fingers tightened against the blanket. I'm sorry. She waited. He didn't fill the space. Eventually she wistfully, it's a good thing she had you, she wasn't alone in her final moments, as if thinking of herself. Yeah, she had me, he said, the weight of memory obvious in his voice. Later, she asked about Sarah. And James told her, about a grocery store collision, a tiny wedding, yellow walls painted too bright for the landlord's liking. He spoke plainly. Without embellishment. Eleanor listened with her eyes closed. When the clock neared 6, she said, "Will you come back?" "Yes," he replied. Eleanor smiled, closed her eyes. And for the first time in weeks, she slept without feeling the gloom of dying. James kept coming back. At first, Eleanor would open her eyes when she heard the chair scrape softly against the floor. Later, she didn't need the sound, she seemed to know he was there before he spoke. Some nights she was strong enough to talk. Other nights she only listened. James brought a book from home after the third visit. The Remains of the Day. He hesitated before opening it, unsure whether she would care. When he told her it had been his wife's favorite, Eleanor smiled faintly and said, "Then read it properly." He did. He read slowly, careful with the words, letting the pauses breathe. Eleanor listened with her eyes closed, her breathing shallow but steady. Once, after a chapter, she whispered that Sarah had chosen well. James smiled before he realized he was smiling. Time began to shift. What had started as an act of decency turned into something expected. When James arrived late one night, Eleanor noticed. When he paused too long in the hallway another evening, she asked where he'd gone. A nurse stopped him once, lowering her voice. "You're in there a lot." "She doesn't have anyone." The nurse nodded. "Just be careful, it is against protocol. You don't want to be fired for caring." Inside the room, Eleanor asked him about his life beyond the building. "Do you ever miss who you used to be?" she asked one night. James thought about that longer than he meant to. "I miss who I was when someone was waiting for me." Eleanor absorbed that quietly. As the days passed, her strength faded in uneven steps. One evening she talked for nearly an hour, about her daughter, about how silence had filled her house after the funeral, about how work had been easier than grief. Another night, she barely spoke at all. James stayed anyway. He learned her rhythms. When the pain came, when the fear followed. When to talk. When not to. Sometimes she would reach for his hand without opening her eyes. Sometimes she squeezed it, as if anchoring herself to the room. Once, after a long silence, she said, "You didn't ask me what I did." "I didn't need to." "That's unusual," she said. "Most people ask immediately." "I'm not most people." She smiled at that, small but genuine. Near the end of the week, a doctor pulled James aside and spoke in the careful voice people used when there was nothing left to soften. James nodded, thanked him, and went back inside. Eleanor's eyes opened when he sat down. Clearer than they'd been all day. She read worried look on his face and asked, "Is it time?" James merely smiled thinly. She held his hand longer than before. Her grip was weaker now, but deliberate. "You made this easier," she said. "Being here." James didn't answer. He just stayed. When morning came, Eleanor was asleep. James left quietly, unsure if he would see her again. At Eleanor's funeral, the chapel was half full. James sat in the back and watched strangers file in. There were distant cousins who looked uncomfortable, business associates checking their phones. A few employees from her company who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. A lawyer stood at the podium. Gave a eulogy about Eleanor's business success. About building a $400 million empire. About her philanthropy and board positions and appearances in Forbes. But nothing about her as a person. Nothing about her loneliness. Her daughter. Her regrets. James stood up quietly. Left before the service ended. He couldn't listen anymore. Outside, the rain had started. James walked to the bus stop. Waited in the rain because he didn't have the energy to care about getting wet. He thought about Eleanor. About 7 nights. About how little time that was. About how it was all the time she had left. He went back to work that night. Mopped the same hallways. Room 237 was occupied again, someone else was waiting. James was invisible again. 3 days after the funeral, James was mopping the hallway near the lobby when someone called his name. "Mr. James Martinez?" James turned. A man in an expensive suit stood there, briefcase in hand, gray hair neatly combed, expression unreadable. "Yes. I'm Robert Mitchell. I was Mrs. Eleanor Harrison's attorney." James stiffened. "Is there a problem?" "No." They sat in an empty waiting room, the building hummed softly around them. Robert slid an envelope across the table. "She asked that you read this first." James opened it carefully. He read slowly, his hands beginning to shake. "James. You stayed when staying was inconvenient. You listened when there was nothing to gain. You never asked who I was. In my life, that was rare. Please accept what I've left you, not as reward, but as trust. Use it the way you used your time. Quietly. Kindly. Eleanor." James folded the letter once. Then again. He looked up at the attorney, uncertain. "I don't understand," he said. "Mrs. Harrison made a change to her will 2 days before she passed," Robert said. "She left you everything." The words hung between them. James didn't move. Then, slowly, tears traced down the sides of his face, not from joy, but from the weight of something he hadn't yet learned how to carry. James Martinez still worked at St. Catherine's Hospice. But not as a janitor anymore. 6 months after Eleanor's death, he stood in front of a new wing of the building. Bright. Modern. Filled with sunlight. A plaque on the wall read, "The Eleanor Harrison Compassionate Care Center. $50 million. That's what it cost to build." James hadn't blinked at the number. Inside were 40 rooms. But these rooms were different. Each had a volunteer station. A comfortable chair. A bookshelf. A window with a view. Because James had one rule for this wing: no one dies alone. Ever. He'd created a program. Trained volunteers. People who would sit with dying patients who had no family. Who would read to them. Hold their hands. Make sure their final days were filled with human connection instead of emptiness. He called it the Eleanor Harrison Compassionate Care Program. And he trained every volunteer himself. Taught them what Eleanor had taught him, that presence is the greatest gift you can give someone who's dying. That being seen is more valuable than anything money can buy. James still lived modestly. Small house in the suburbs. Normal car. Simple life. But he'd given away $200 million so far. To hospices. To hospitals. To cancer research. To programs that helped people who were forgotten. Every night before bed, he read Eleanor's letter. Reminded himself that he'd been invisible for so long. Until the night he decided one lonely woman shouldn't die alone. That one decision changed 2 lives. Eleanor's last 7 days. And every single day James had after.